6,821 young Americans died on an island called Iwo Jima. None of them lived long enough to find out what the island was actually for. The answer arrived at dawn on the 7th of April 1945, and when it arrived it changed the war. The morning began with the smell of volcanic ash. The dead lay in long straight rows under wooden crosses on that black sand island, their helmets hung on the markers, the wind tugging at the dog tags. They had been told only that the rocks and the dust and the caves full of Japanese defenders had to be cleared. That the island mattered. The Marines who buried them did not yet know why either, but the answer arrived at dawn. 108 P-51D Mustangs began to taxi. Their engines spoke in a language the Pacific had not heard before. Not the deep growl of a Hellcat, not the roar of a Corsair, something cleaner, higher, a British engine built in Detroit. A Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, 12 cylinders in a V, 1695 horsepower at takeoff, water injection ready to be triggered. The propellers chopped at the salt air. The fuselages were polished aluminum, bare metal, no paint, because paint added weight and weight was the enemy. The cockpit canopies were bubbles of clear plexiglass. They reflected the dawn. Each Mustang carried 490 gallons of internal fuel. 2 more drop tanks slung under the wings carried another 220, 650 caliber machine guns in the wings. 1,880 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, and one young man strapped into a seat barely wider than his shoulders who would not be permitted to stand, to stretch, to relieve himself for the next 7 hours. The mission was 750 miles, one way, over open ocean, in a single-engine aircraft. Military planners had said it was impossible. The Mustangs lifted off into a sky that was still pink at the edges. Mount Suribachi fell away beneath them, the volcano where the flag had been raised, the place where the photograph that would define a generation had been taken. They turned north, they climbed. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft of the 15th Fighter Group, Colonel John W. Mitchell felt the Merlin settle into its cruise. He was 30 years old. He looked older. 2 years earlier, almost to the day, he had led 18 P-38 Lightnings out of Guadalcanal, 16 of which reached the intercept point on a mission so secret that only a handful of officers knew the target. The target had been a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Mitchell's pilots had found Yamamoto's transport plane exactly where Navy codebreakers said it would be, exactly when they said it would be there, and they had shot it down into the jungle of Bougainville. Yamamoto's body was found the next day, still strapped in the wreckage, still in his white gloves. Now, 2 years later, Mitchell was flying toward Yamamoto's country. He did not think about that. He thought about fuel. Behind him in the same formation was a quieter man. Major James B. Tapp, 25 years old, soft-spoken, methodical. He had been an instructor before he was a fighter pilot. He still flew like one, economical, precise, no wasted motion. He did not curse on the radio. He did not boast in the officers' mess. He read his combat manuals the way other men read mystery novels. When he closed his canopy that morning over Iwo Jima, he had checked his gun sight 3 times. The reticle had to be exact. At the speeds they would be flying, a half-degree of error meant a clean miss. Tapp had never fired his guns at another aircraft. That would change before lunch. 750 miles to the north, in a wood-paneled office in Tokyo, a Japanese staff officer was reading a report he refused to believe. The report came from a coastal radar station. It said that a large formation of single-engine fighter aircraft was approaching the Japanese coast from the south, from the direction of Iwo Jima. The staff officer set the report down. He picked it up again. He had personally signed the briefing distributed to fighter units of the 10th Air Division 3 weeks earlier. The briefing stated, in clear written Japanese, that no American single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach Tokyo from any base then in American hands. The briefing stated that any escort attached to a B-29 formation over the home islands could only be carrier aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, and would therefore arrive only on days when American carriers were within strike range, which intelligence would announce in advance. There were no American carriers within strike range that morning. The staff officer asked the radar operator to confirm. The radar operator confirmed. The staff officer was silent for a long moment. Then he ordered the report filed for review. He did not pass it to operational units. He was, he later wrote in his diary, certain there had been an error, a flock of birds perhaps, a misread return. The interceptors did not scramble. The Mustangs continued north, unopposed, for another 40 minutes. In a small wooden room near Chofu Airfield on the outskirts of Tokyo, a 24-year-old major named Teruhiko Kobayashi was finishing a cup of tea. He was the youngest fighter group commander in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. He looked younger than that. He had a thin face and quiet eyes, and a way of speaking to his pilots that did not raise his voice. His command was the 244th Sentai. They flew the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, the only inline engine fighter in Japanese service, and a smaller number of the new Ki-100, a desperate hybrid built by bolting a radial engine onto a Hien airframe because Japan could no longer manufacture the inline engines reliably. Earlier that year, in January, Kobayashi had taken a hen up to attack a formation of B-29s. He had emptied his cannons. He had hit nothing of consequence, so he had aimed his aircraft at the wing root of a superfortress and rammed it. The B-29 had broken in half. Kobayashi had blown clear of his disintegrating fighter, opened his parachute, and landed in a rice paddy alive. The newspapers had called him a hero. He had not enjoyed the attention. He had asked quietly to be allowed to return to flying. That morning, Kobayashi did not know about the radar report. He knew only that the air raid sirens had begun. He set down the tea. He walked to his aircraft. The Hien was warm in the morning sun. His ground crew, 2 men who had not eaten properly in weeks, helped him into the cockpit. They tightened the straps. They saluted. He returned the salute. The Merlin engine in the P-51 was a marvel of 2-stage supercharging. The engine in Kobayashi's Hien was a Kawasaki Ha-40. It had been built from a license-bought German Daimler-Benz design. The Japanese factories had never quite mastered it. Half of his squadron's aircraft were grounded with engine failures on any given morning. Kobayashi did not know what was coming. His radio was barely functional. The vacuum tubes inside it drained the battery so quickly that he had learned to switch it off between transmissions. The briefing he had received that morning told him to expect another formation of unescorted B-29s flying high, vulnerable to a head-on pass if his pilots could climb fast enough. He had been told nothing about fighters. He throttled up. The Hien began to roll. Above the Pacific, at 23,000 feet, James Tapp saw Mount Fuji. He had been told about it. Every pilot had. The briefing had said, "When you see Fuji, you are close." The mountain rose from the morning haze, snow-capped, perfectly conical, almost too beautiful to be real. For a moment, Tapp forgot to check his fuel gauge. Then he checked it. Then he checked his oxygen flow. Then his engine instruments. Then his wingman. Then his fuel gauge again. Below the formation, the coast of Honshu unrolled like a map. Tapp could see rice fields. He could see roads. He could see a thin line of black smoke rising from a small town. Somebody's cooking fire, somebody's mourning. He could see, very faintly, the streets of Tokyo in the distance. 6 million people, the capital of an empire. The Mustangs dropped their auxiliary tanks. The silver shapes tumbled away, glinting in the sun, falling 4 miles to the earth. Some of them exploded when they hit the ground. Some bounced across rice paddies and came to rest in farmers' fields. A farmer who looked up that morning and saw a polished aluminum tank fall out of the sky in front of him would, decades later, still remember the silence that followed it. The lightened Mustangs accelerated. 3 minutes later, Tapp saw the first Japanese fighters climbing to meet them. There were dozens. They were small at this altitude. They climbed in the old textbook 3-plane formation that Japanese pilots had learned from manuals printed in 1941. The lead aircraft committed first. The wingmen were supposed to follow. They did not follow. Tapp's radio came alive. American voices, calm, professional, calling out positions. He pushed his throttle forward. The Merlin sang. He rolled into a diving turn that would put him on the high side of the climbing Japanese formation in 8 seconds. In one of those climbing Japanese aircraft, Major Kobayashi looked up through his canopy. He saw silver shapes in the morning sun. He counted them. He stopped counting. He keyed his radio. The radio did not work. He waved his wings instead, the old signal, and his wingmen saw him and looked up and understood. They were not B-29s. They were fighters. In an interview he gave more than 2 decades later, Kobayashi would describe what he felt in that moment as something more specific than fear. It was the feeling of a man who has been lied to for a long time and who realizes all at once exactly what the lie has cost. The Mustangs were here. The home islands were no longer the home islands. The war was already over. It would just take 4 months for someone to say so. He pushed his throttle to the firewall. The half-40 engine, complaining, sputtering on 80-octane fuel distilled in part from pine roots, began to climb toward the silver shapes above him. It was 0700 hours. The first American single-engine fighter ever to fly over Tokyo was about to open fire. The first burst lasted less than 2 seconds. James Tapp came down out of the sun at 430 miles an hour, the way every fighter pilot since the First World War had been taught to attack. His diving turn put him on the high side of the climbing Japanese formation. He squeezed the trigger on his control stick. 650 caliber Brownings opened up in the wings of his Mustang. The recoil shuddered through the airframe. Brass shell casings poured from the ejection ports and tumbled in the slipstream behind him. A Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, a heavy twin-engine fighter the Allies called Nick, flew into the stream of incendiary rounds and came apart. It did not explode. That happens in movies. In real combat, an aircraft hit by armor-piercing incendiary rounds at close range simply ceases to be an aircraft. Pieces detach, the fuel tank ruptures, a streamer of white vapor turns into a streamer of orange flame, and the thing that was a fighter with 2 men inside becomes a falling collection of burning parts. Tapp pulled up. The G-load pressed him into his seat. His G-suit, the inflatable bladders sewn into his flight suit, squeezed his legs to push the blood back toward his brain. The Japanese pilots in the formation below him had no G-suits. None had ever been issued. As they tried to follow him, their vision narrowed. Some of them blacked out at the top of their climb and recovered only when the dive brought them back below 10,000 feet. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the air over Tokyo was full of falling things. Tapp shot down 3 more aircraft before he turned for home. 2 Ki-44s, 1 Ki-61, 4 kills on his first combat mission. He did not feel triumphant. He felt thirsty. His relief tube had frozen at altitude. His legs were cramping. His eyes burned from the dry oxygen. When he landed at Iwo Jima 7 hours after taking off, he could not climb out of his cockpit without help. He had to be lifted onto the wing. He sat there for a moment in the volcanic dust and let his ground crew unbuckle him. The intelligence officer was waiting with a clipboard. Tapp said, 4. The intelligence officer wrote it down. That was the whole conversation. Across the formation, the 7th Fighter Command tallied 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 1 probable, 5 damaged. They had lost 2 Mustangs and 1 pilot. The kill ratio was 13-1. It would only get worse, but the official numbers, then and now, tell only part of the truth. Japanese records, recovered after the war and translated by American historians in the 1950s, show that the 10th Air Division actually lost 10 aircraft that day, not 26. American pilots in combat, dodging tracer fire, watching their wingmen, watching their fuel, watching the sky for the next attacker. They could not always tell whether an enemy fighter was destroyed or merely damaged and trailing smoke. Pilots are not bookkeepers. Both sides overclaimed in every war. The truth is somewhere in the wreckage that nobody found. What is not in dispute is what the report did to the Japanese command. The same staff officer who had filed the radar warning that morning sat at his desk that evening, reading the after-action accounts coming in from the survivors. Pilots described single-engine American fighters that had outclimbed them, outdived them, outshot them, and disappeared south toward the open ocean. The pilots spoke of a strange new aircraft, long-nosed, sleek, with a clear bubble canopy and no radiator scoop on top of the engine. The drawings the pilots made in their debriefs were sent to Tokyo. The intelligence section identified the aircraft within hours. P-51D Mustang, North American Aviation, Inglewood, California. The staff officer wrote in his diary that night that he did not understand how this was possible. He would have understood it better if he had stood for one afternoon in a North American aviation plant in 1944. Inside those plants in Inglewood and in Dallas, the assembly lines moved at the pace of a slow walk. A fuselage entered one end of the line as a riveted aluminum shell. It left the other end, 63 production stations later, as a complete flying machine. A new Mustang came off the line every hour. By the time the war ended, 15,586 P-50Os of all variants had been built. The D model alone accounted for 8,156 aircraft. The total Japanese production of all fighter types, of every kind, throughout the last 2 years of the war was less than that one number. A Mustang was not built by craftsmen. It was built by interchangeable parts and standardized tooling and trained American women working second shifts because their husbands were overseas. The wing of any P-51D would fit the fuselage of any other P-51D. The instrument panels were identical. The control cables ran in the same routes. A pilot could climb into any one of the 8,000 and feel, immediately, that he was home. The Japanese fighter that Major Kobayashi flew that morning, the Kawasaki Ki-61, was built differently. It was built by men who took pride in their work, who shaped components by hand, who measured tolerances with calipers because Japanese industry had never fully mechanized those measurements. They did the best they could with what they had. By 1945, what they had was very little. The steel for the landing gear was inferior. The aluminum for the wing spars contained impurities, the fuel for the engines, the oil for the bearings, the rubber for the tires, all of it was getting worse, month by month, week by week. 2 Kawasaki engineers had calculated, in 1942, the production schedule that Japan would need to maintain in order to replace combat losses. In 1945, Japanese production was at 31% of that schedule. Kobayashi knew none of these numbers. He did not need to know them. He could see them on his flight line every morning. His 244th Sentai had nominal strength of 48 aircraft. On most mornings, 16 were flyable. The rest were grounded for parts that did not exist, for repairs that could not be made, for engines that had been removed and never reinstalled because there was nothing to reinstall them with. The hangar at Chofu was full of fighter aircraft that would never fly again. The ground crews kept them out of the rain anyway. It seemed disrespectful to do otherwise. On the morning after the first Mustang raid, Kobayashi walked his flight line. His ground crew chief, a 40-year-old sergeant named Watanabe, walked beside him. They stopped at each aircraft. The chief said, "This one, the engine will not start in cold weather. This one, the landing gear collapsed twice last week. This one, the canopy will not lock properly above 10,000 feet. This one," the chief paused, "this one is fine." Kobayashi nodded. Then he said, very quietly, the thing he had been thinking since the day before. He said they were not supposed to be able to reach us. The chief said nothing. There was nothing to say. There is, in the history of every war, a moment when the participants understand, without anyone telling them, without a newspaper reporting it, without a general making a speech, that the war has already been decided. For the Japanese fighter pilots who flew that April, the moment was the morning of the 7th, when single-engine American fighters appeared above the Imperial Palace. They did not stop flying. They would not stop flying for 4 more months, but none of them after that morning expected to win. What followed, through the spring of 1945, was not a contest between equals. It was a demonstration. The American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima had completed an average of 460 hours of flight training before they reached the combat zone. 120 hours in their assigned aircraft, dozens of hours of aerial gunnery against towed targets, combat tactics taught by veterans who had flown over Germany and France and Italy and the Solomons and come home alive. The Japanese pilots they faced had, by the spring of 1945, an average of 50 hours of flight training. Some had 30, some had less. The Japanese training program had not failed gradually. It had failed in a particular traceable way that historians can still document. In 1942, after the carrier disasters at Midway, the Imperial Navy had begun rushing its pilot candidates through accelerated programs. The Army had followed. By 1944, the basic instructional aircraft were being scrapped to provide aluminum for combat aircraft. By 1945, fuel for training flights had become essentially non-existent. New pilots assigned to combat squadrons sometimes arrived having never fired their aircraft's guns. Never. Not once. Their first burst of cannon fire would be the one they fired at an American fighter, and they would not know how the recoil affected their aim, and they would not know how to lead a target moving at 300 miles an hour, and most of them would die before they had a chance to learn. This was not a failure of courage. The young men of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service were as brave as any pilots who flew in that war. It was a failure of arithmetic, a 10-to-1 deficit in flight hours, a 3-to-1 deficit in aircraft production, a 5-to-1 deficit in fuel quality, a 100-to-1 deficit in industrial capacity. The young men flew anyway. They climbed into aircraft they had barely been trained to fly against an enemy they had been told was not coming, and they died in numbers that have never been fully counted. By the middle of May, the Mustangs were flying over Tokyo almost daily. They escorted the B-29s on incendiary raids. They flew alone on fighter sweeps, hunting whatever moved on Japanese airfields. They strafed trains. They strafed boats in Tokyo Bay. They strafed staff cars on coastal roads. Civilians in farming villages learned to look up when they heard the high, clean whistle of a Merlin engine in a dive. And then, on the first day of June 1945, the Pacific killed 27 of them. The morning briefing in the operations tent at Iwo Jima had called for clear skies along the route to Osaka. The weather reconnaissance B-29, which always flew ahead of fighter operations, had reported scattered clouds and good visibility. 148 Mustangs took off in 3 waves, climbed to formation altitude, and turned north. They flew into a wall. The storm front had not been there 4 hours earlier. It had developed during the morning over the East China Sea and moved east faster than anyone had predicted. It extended from sea level to 40,000 feet. There was no way over it. There was no way around it. By the time the lead pilots realized what they were flying into, they were already inside it. Their compasses began to spin. Their artificial horizons tumbled. St. Elmo's fire, a blue-violet electrical glow that dances along the leading edges of an aircraft in heavy static, appeared on their propeller tips and crawled along their canopies. They could not see each other. A Mustang pilot named Robert Anderson, in the middle of the second wave, would later describe what happened next as the worst moments of his life. He felt his aircraft begin to roll. He could not tell whether he was right side up or upside down. His vacuum-driven instruments had given up. He pulled back on the stick because that is what pilots do when they are afraid, and the airframe groaned, and he realized he had been diving. He recovered at 3,000 feet, breaking out of the cloud just above the ocean, and saw 2 other Mustangs in front of him in the same instant. One was burning. The other had no pilot in the cockpit. Anderson banked away. He never knew their names. When the survivors landed at Iwo Jima, the count came in slowly. 2 missing, then 5, then 12, then 20. The final number was 27 aircraft lost, 24 of them to weather. The Japanese fired no shots that day. The Mustangs had been destroyed by a meteorological event that did not appear on any chart. By air pressure and rain and ice and the limits of 1945 navigation equipment, the pilots called it Black Friday for the rest of their lives. The men who survived it dreamed about it for 50 years afterward. Some of them never flew again. This is the part of the story that does not appear in the films. The Pacific killed more American fighter pilots than the Japanese did in those last months. Not all of them, but more than the Empire did. The ocean does not care about courage or industrial capacity. The ocean is older than both. While the Mustangs flew, the Japanese tried to keep their own aircraft in the sky on whatever fuel they could manufacture. By the spring of 1945, conventional aviation gasoline had become almost unobtainable in the home islands. The American submarine campaign had cut off oil imports from the Dutch East Indies. The refineries that remained operational were running on captured stockpiles that grew thinner every week, so the Japanese government, in one of the most desperate industrial decisions of the war, ordered the extraction of fuel from pine roots. It was called the Matsune program. Matsune, pine root. School children were sent into the forest with shovels. They dug up pine stumps. The stumps were hauled to distillation facilities, small, crude operations set up in former sake breweries and rural processing plants. The stumps were heated in retorts until they released their oils. The oils were further distilled into something that could, in theory, be burned in an aircraft engine. By American post-war estimates, the ratio was roughly 200 pine stumps to 1 gallon of usable fuel. The fuel was rated at approximately 80 octane. American aviation gasoline was rated at 100 octane, often 130. What that meant in practical terms was that Japanese engines using pine root fuel pre-ignited. The fuel detonated in the combustion chamber before the spark plug fired. The piston was pushed downward against the rising motion of the crankshaft. Cylinders cracked, pistons fractured, connecting rods bent. Engines that had been designed to deliver 2,000 horsepower delivered 1,500, then 1,200, then nothing at all. Kobayashi's pilots flew on pine root fuel through the early summer of 1945. Their engines failed in the air, in the climb, on takeoff. Sometimes the engine ran roughly but kept turning. Sometimes it seized, sometimes it caught fire. The crew chief, Watanabe, kept the records. By the end of May, the 244th Sentai was losing more aircraft to engine failure than to enemy action. And then, in early July, a courier from Air Defense Headquarters arrived at Chofu with new orders. Kobayashi read them in his small wooden office. Then he read them again. The orders directed that all serviceable fighter aircraft of the 244th Sentai be withdrawn from active interception duties. The aircraft were to be dispersed, camouflaged, and held in reserve. They were not to be flown except by direct order from headquarters. The reserve fuel was to be stockpiled for the defense of Japan against an Allied amphibious invasion now expected in the autumn. The operation was code-named Olympic by the Americans. The Japanese plan to defeat it was called Ketsugo. Kobayashi looked up from the orders. Outside his office, his ground crews were working on aircraft that would no longer be permitted to fly. He understood what the orders meant. The Empire had calculated that it could not afford to spend its remaining fighters in conventional defense. The fighters were being saved to ram American landing craft, to crash into American transport ships, to die in the way that the Divine Wind units, the kamikaze, were dying off the coast of Okinawa. His pilots were being saved so that they could be used up later. He thought about telling them. He decided not to. He walked outside instead into the July heat and watched the men working. They were laughing at something. He did not catch the joke. They were so young. Half of them had not yet started shaving. They saluted when they saw him. He returned the salute and kept walking. Above the airfield, very high up, two thin white contrails drew themselves across the summer sky. P-50Os. They were flying east. Toward the coast, toward Iwo Jima. They had spent the morning over Tokyo, and they were going home, and they would be home for dinner, and tomorrow they would come back. Kobayashi watched them until they were gone. Then he turned and walked back into the office where the orders were lying open on his desk, and he sat down, and for a long time he did not move. By the second week of August, there was almost nothing left to shoot down. The fighter sweeps continued. The Mustangs took off from Iwo Jima at dawn, flew the 750 miles north, descended over the home islands and found empty airfields. The Japanese aircraft they had hunted in April were gone. Some had been destroyed in the air. More had been destroyed on the ground. The rest had been dispersed into woods and under farmhouses and into camouflaged revetments along country roads, hidden and silent, waiting for an invasion that the Americans were already choosing, in conference rooms half a world away, not to launch. On the 10th of August, 1945, the 15th and 56th Fighter Groups found a small formation of Japanese fighters near Tokyo. They claimed 7 kills. It was the last real air battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese pilots who took off that morning were boys, most of them, with cloth helmets and uniforms that no longer fit them properly because Japan no longer had the cloth to make uniforms in the right sizes. They climbed because they had been ordered to climb. They fought because they did not know how to do anything else. They died, most of them, before they understood what had killed them. In a small room in Chofu, a 24-year-old major named Teruhiko Kobayashi was still alive. He had outlasted his squadron. The 47th Sentai, the other major fighter unit defending Tokyo, had begun April with 40 operational pilots. By the second week of August, 3 remained. His own 244th had been hollowed out the same way, not by a single catastrophe, but by attrition that had become invisible because it was constant. A pilot lost on Monday, 2 on Wednesday, 4 on Saturday. The replacements arriving were 19-year-old boys who had been school teachers 6 months earlier. They did not last a week. Kobayashi flew when he was permitted to fly, which was rarely. The order to conserve aircraft for the coming invasion had not been rescinded. He spent most of his days walking the dispersal areas, talking to his ground crews, reading old letters from his family, and watching the sky for contrails. He saw them often. The Mustangs no longer flew in tight formations over Tokyo. They had nothing left to fear. They flew in loose pairs, sometimes singly, gliding across the summer sky at 15,000 feet as casually as a man walking through his own neighborhood. This was the part of defeat that Kobayashi later said he had not been prepared for, not the losses, not the deaths of his friends. The casual confidence of the enemy, the way the Mustangs had stopped pretending that the sky over Japan was contested. Then, on the morning of the 14th of August, 2 more Mustangs took off from Iwo Jima. In one cockpit was Lieutenant Jerry Yellen, 21 years old, of the 78th Fighter Squadron. In the other was 2nd Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg, 19 years old, on his first major combat mission. Schlamberg had arrived at the squadron only a few weeks earlier. He was thin, dark-haired, quiet. He had grown up in Brooklyn. He had told Yellen before takeoff that he had a feeling about this mission. He had said, "If I go up there today, I won't be coming back." The commander had told him he could stay behind. Schlamberg had shaken his head. He had said, "I'd rather fly." They took off at 4:30 in the morning. Their target was an airfield complex near Nagoya. The orders had been issued the day before, and by the time the formation was airborne, half the world already knew that Japan had agreed to surrender. In Tokyo, that same day, the Imperial Conference was finalizing Japan's surrender. By evening, the Emperor would record the broadcast that ended the war. Junior officers in the War Ministry had been arrested attempting to steal the disc and prevent its broadcast. The Empire was disintegrating in the hours while Yellen and Schlamberg flew north. A recall message was prepared at Iwo Jima. The code word was Utah, 2 flat syllables, easy to recognize over a damaged radio. The message was transmitted on the proper frequency at the proper time. It did not reach Yellen and Schlamberg's aircraft. Why it did not reach them has been studied and never fully explained. Atmospheric interference is the usual answer. The ionosphere over the Western Pacific in August 1945 was unusually active. Solar conditions degraded shortwave reception. The radios in the Mustangs, beautiful by Japanese standards, were still vacuum tube equipment subject to the physics of the upper atmosphere. The transmission left Iwo Jima. It arrived somewhere. It did not arrive in the cockpit of Philip Schlamberg's airplane. The 2 Mustangs crossed the coast at dawn. They descended over the Nagoya airfield. They strafed parked aircraft and fuel revetments. Anti-aircraft fire came up at them from the ground. Japanese gunners who had not received the surrender word either, who were doing their duty in the only way they understood. Yellen banked into a cloud bank to escape the flak. Schlamberg followed him, slightly behind, slightly below. When Yellen came out of the cloud, Schlamberg was not there. Yellen called for him on the radio. There was no answer. He circled the area for as long as his fuel permitted. He saw no aircraft, no parachute, no fire on the ground that he could identify. He turned south alone and flew the 750 miles home with the empty sky beside him where his wingman was supposed to be. Philip Schlamberg, 19 years old, of Brooklyn, was never found. His aircraft was never found. His body was never recovered. He has no grave. He has, on the wall of the Courts of the Missing at the Honolulu Memorial, his name carved in stone, with the names of thousands of other men whose deaths were certified by the absence of a return. The Japanese surrendered later that day. Schlamberg had been killed, almost certainly after the surrender broadcast was already being prepared for transmission. He was the last American combat pilot to die in the Second World War. He died in a fight that no one needed to fight anymore, attacking an airfield whose defenders did not yet know they had won the right to stop defending it. His death was, in the most precise sense of the word, useless. That is the thing that the men who knew him could never quite get past. Jerry Yellen flew home that morning, landed at Iwo Jima, and was met on the runway by the news that the war was over. He never talked about Schlamberg, except once or twice, late in his life when reporters asked. He said the same thing each time. He said he shouldn't have been there. That was all. The Empire of Japan signed its instrument of surrender on the 2nd of September on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Allied aircraft flew over the ceremony. Among them were Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, the same units that had appeared over Tokyo unannounced on the 7th of April. The same men in the same aircraft. They flew low and tight in formation, the way they had been taught to fly at flight schools in Arizona and California 3 years earlier. 18 days earlier, on the 15th of August, in a small town outside Tokyo, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi had listened to the Emperor's surrender broadcast on a radio that no longer needed to conserve its batteries. He sat very still while it played. When it was over, he walked outside to where his last hien sat under its camouflage netting, waiting for orders that would never come. He looked at it for a while, then he walked away. He survived the war. When the new Japan rebuilt itself, Kobayashi went back to the only thing he knew. He joined the Japan Air Self-Defense Force in the 1950s, the small, careful, defensive air arm of a country that had given up offensive war by constitution. He flew jets now, T-33 trainers. The Cold War had begun, and the men who had fought the last war were teaching the next generation to fly the next one. He did not get to grow old. On the 4th of May 1957, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi was killed in a T-33 crash near Hamamatsu, 12 years after the war he had been told he could not lose. He was 37. He had outlasted his Sentai, outlasted the Empire, outlasted the war itself, and then he had been killed by an aircraft accident in peacetime, in his own country, in a sky no Mustang would ever cross again. What he thought about the Mustangs in those 12 quiet years he kept to himself. He gave few interviews. He wrote no memoir. The young men he had watched die in the spring of 1945 stayed with him in whatever silence a man like that carries. And then the silence became permanent. In the entire history of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, 3,514 Nakajima Ki-84 Hayates were built. They were said on paper to be the finest fighters Japan ever produced. Today, in the entire world, one survives. It sits in the Shiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima in southern Japan, restored, motionless, lit from above. Schoolchildren walk past it on field trips. Their teachers tell them what it was. The teachers do not always know the names of the young men who flew it. Hundreds of P-51 Mustangs still exist. Dozens of them still fly. On any given weekend, somewhere in the United States, at an airshow in Texas, at a memorial flight in California, at a county fair in Iowa, you can stand on a sun-warmed runway and watch a Merlin engine run up on a P-51. The sound has not changed. It is the same sound that the men of the 244th Sentai heard very high above their airfield on a July afternoon in 1945. That is, in the end, the strange arithmetic of industrial war. The side that wins keeps its machines. The side that loses keeps only its silences. The young men who flew those airplanes, on both sides, were almost all the same age, 20, 21, 24, 19. They believed what they had been told to believe. They flew as well as they had been trained to fly. They were brave in the same particular ways that young men have always been brave. The aluminum did not care. The fuel did not care. The factories in Inglewood and the factories in Nagoya did not care. The mathematics of production and training and supply did not care. The Mustangs came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that, until there was nothing left to come back for. That is what the Japanese pilots who lived to grow old understood about the war. It was not that they had fought badly. It was that nothing they could have done would have been enough. Their courage had been spent against an arithmetic that had been decided in conference rooms and on factory floors long before the first Mustang ever crossed the coast of Honshu in the spring of 1945. Industrial war does not judge courage, it only counts, and by the time the counting was done, the silver airplanes were over Tokyo, the boys in the Heians were climbing to meet them, the war was already over, and only the dying remained.